Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. My name is Tariq Masood. I'm a professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School and the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative. And it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event with soon-to-be Professor Erin York. Dr. York is a postdoctoral research fellow with us here at the Middle East Initiative this year. Her recently accepted dissertation and soon-to-be book examines a question that social scientists have been asking for a very long time, which is basically what is the function of pseudo-democratic institutions like legislatures in regimes that themselves are not democratic. And she focuses particularly on the ways in which opposition parties choose or choose not to participate in these pseudo-democratic institutions and the drivers of why citizens may or may not support them. She has received many accolades for her superb work, including a National Science Graduate Research Fellowship. She just got her PhD from Columbia, and she earned her BS from Yale. I've been told that my introductions of our fellows are sometimes over the top. They may be over the top, but they are deeply sincere. That said, I'm going to try to tone down a little bit. Here's what I will say about Dr. York. She's been just such an important presence in our program this year, and is just, so exceptionally brilliant that it has gotten to the point where if I'm saying something in a faculty seminar or a graduate seminar, I will look to see Dr. York's reaction. If she is nodding, I have this enormous feeling that I'm on the right track. It's exactly the same feeling I used to get when my dissertation advisors would give me a pat on the back. That's the level of respect and admiration I have for this extraordinary scholar. So I am really thrilled that we're going to have a chance to hear her work today. Let me just describe some of the ground rules. Dr. York is going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes for question and answer. Today's event is being recorded and will live online on Harvard's websites and some of our other online channels. And so I would ask everybody to be aware of that, because when you ask a question, that question will become part of the record that may be included in the recording. Now, if you'd like to participate in the event and ask a question, but you want to be off the recording, then I would say you should mute both your microphone and your video, and you could even rename yourself so that only your first name is shown on your frame or in the chat box. If you'd like to ask a question, but you don't want to ask it on video, you can also submit your question through the chat box. However, I would encourage everybody to try to participate with their video and voice if you're comfortable, because that will make the event a closer simulation of what would have happened had we had the good fortune to be in the same room as Dr. York. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to our speaker for this afternoon, and I ask you all to offer a warm welcome to her. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tariq. I'm really looking forward to sharing my research with you today. It's a little bit strange to do this over Zoom, so bear with me if there are technical difficulties, and please give a shout out if you can't hear anything or if you miss something. But otherwise, I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. So I'll enter the share screen now. Let's do this. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so today I want to talk to you guys about how governance works under autocracy, with a focus on autocratic institutions. And these institutions ostensibly create opportunities for political contestation, but they also function in parallel with what I see as kind of pre-existing networks of power in a lot of these settings. In a general sense, I'm hoping to show you guys that by the book politics, that is, politics that follow the rules as they are written, can still operate when a kind of off-the-books backroom politics is the norm in a particular setting. So I want to start, motivate this talk by discussing what I see as two competing versions of how politics operate in Morocco, the case under study today. And I think this picture is a good illustration of these two kind of versions of politics. On the right, you have the current king, Mohammed Sadis, sitting down with, on the left, Abdelila Ben Kiran, who's the former prime minister of Morocco and the head of the Islamist Party of Justice and Development. And I think this is kind of an interesting picture because on the one hand, you have a contested head of government, the prime minister, who's selected through open legislative elections and who happens in this case to represent an Islamist opposition party. On the other hand, you have the head of state, in this case, the hereditary monarch, and essentially the core of the patronage network that is commonly kind of stated to dominate politics in this setting. This picture is actually from the previous parliamentary term, and I think that this juxtaposition is made all the more poignant by the fact that Ben Kiran is no longer prime minister, though his party is still the electoral leader in Morocco. At the beginning of the current term, he was actually ousted from the position through kind of palace interference in government negotiations. So this sort of showing how these two versions of politics butt up against one another in practice. And I want to clarify what I mean by these competing conceptions of Moroccan politics. So first, you have the version of politics as it's written on paper. That is what the Constitution spells out. This looks like a fairly typical parliamentary arrangement, albeit one with a very powerful unelected head of state. In this version of politics, political parties compete for office at a variety of administrative levels, and there's delegation of authorities to different offices. So the legislature has lawmaking power. There's some decentralization of authorities to local councils and so forth. On the other hand, we have what we see taking place in practice. Most scholars and observers of Morocco would agree that today politics are still very much under the control of the Makhzen, this historical network of elites that have kind of been in charge since the French occupation. Political competition is said to be dominated by the use of patronage. One scholar actually termed Morocco a, quote, giant patronage machine, which is governed more by connections to the monarch and this historical network of power rather than electoral mandate. So I think this is interesting as well because it echoes a tension that exists within a broader political science theory of co-optation. Under co-optation theory, the autocrat uses institutions to create meaningful bodies that can serve as a credible commitment to some form of power sharing and thereby ensure the cooperation of other political actors. But observers of the reality of a lot of autocracies, not just Morocco, tend to downplay the role of these bodies in governance in general. So the question of whether the autocrat derives support from the selectorate or the paper documents is kind of a chicken and egg problem. The source of autocratic power may in fact be the support of the selectorate, but those paper documents, the Constitution, must have some credibility if that support is going to continue. So how do we reconcile these two versions of Moroccan politics? Do we think that the Constitution is just a paper veneer for this system of patronage that props up the historical elite? Or do we also see some signs of meaningful meritocratic competition between these elite and other political outsiders? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm going to argue that these institutions actually do have relevance for political outcomes. They're not just, paper facades for this old system. Actually, I think that they provide a pathway to representation and thereby influencing electoral outcomes. So I think that these are especially important for political outsiders that lack access to the traditional networks, in particular because these offer a substitute mechanism by which to provide constituency service. And I also find that voters reward politicians for engaging in constituency service through this mechanism. But this is not unlimited authority to attract support. There are challenges here that are particular to autocracy. In particular, a hallmark of this type of governance is a pretty strong imbalance of power between in favor of the executive and away from the contested legislature. So as a result, legislative oversight towards the executive actually depends on the cooperation of that executive. And this in turn provides an opportunity for weakening the effectiveness of this by the books version of politics. As evidence today, I'm going to present systematic data on constituency effort and executive response from within the Moroccan legislature. I'm going to measure the constituency effort by deputies, and I'm also going to show the extent to which ministers respond to legislative requests. And then I will also examine how legislative requests relate to electoral outcomes. I'll present three key findings. First, that political outsiders are vastly more likely to make use of these by-the-book authorities, suggesting that they do in fact serve as a substitute for the patronage mechanisms that parties linked to the regime employ. Second, I will show that this activity is linked to electoral success. And then finally, I will demonstrate that technocrat ministers selected by the regime serve as an impediment to the activity by refusing to respond to legislative requests at a much greater rate than partisan ministers. So I think taken collectively, the findings here serve to illustrate the push and pull of cooptative institutions under autocracy. First, on the one hand, how opposition actors can adapt to the rules of the game to compete for political support. And on the other hand, how the regime might be able to counter this through the exercise of his executive authorities. All right, so I'm going to jump straight into the context here to describe the kind of political lay of the land in Morocco and also identify the institutional mechanism of interest. So Morocco is a constitutional monarchy with roughly 60 years of elected legislative history. As I've described from the outside, the parliamentary institutions at work here look very similar to those elsewhere. And most recently, the reforms from following the Arab Spring ensure that the prime minister comes from the winning party from what have generally been competitive elections without substantial fraud. And these elections are contested pretty broadly by an increasing number of political parties, both with and without PALS connections. I'll talk a little bit about how political competition at the legislative level works. Elections in Morocco tend to be quite intense. There are an increasing number of parties. Today, more than 30 regularly participate in elections, though only around 8 won more than a handful of seats in any given national election. And parties are generally categorized according to whether or not they have linkages to the palace, royalist, or whether they don't, non-royalist or opposition. I'll use those terms interchangeably today. Notably, despite the fact that royalist parties are most closely linked to the patronage networks that are supposed to dominate politics here, opposition parties have actually been remarkably successful in this context. The Islamist PJD, Ben Kiran, the prime minister that I showed you is from that party, has won actually the last 2 national elections. And if you look at the distribution of seats from the 2011 parliament, you can see that the parliament has been roughly split between these 2 types of parties, with a slight edge actually going to opposition parties. And I should clarify here that opposition parties in this setting do not function as a bloc. It's quite a fragmented opposition scene with both Islamists, secular leftists, and centrists, all operating and not necessarily cooperating very much. Nevertheless, there's some evidence also that royalists and opposition parties compete in the same space. So this plot, or this map, shows the distribution of royalist and non-royalist seats across Morocco. The white districts show places where there was a 50-50 split of seats between an opposition or royalist deputy. And in fact, that's the median outcome here. So there are some individual party strongholds, but very little geographical pattern based on party affiliation. And this holds at the municipal level as well. I also want to briefly mention how government formation works. And by this, I'm referring to the formation of a cabinet headed by the prime minister, although there's sort of a supra cabinet entity that is headed by the king in this context. The government formation is in Morocco fairly subject to palace influence, unlike in other parliamentary institutions. As elsewhere, following legislative elections, the winning party or parties seek to form a cabinet of ministers to oversee the bureaucracy. But in this case, the prime minister and the king jointly determine the remainder of the cabinet. And this gives the king, the palace, quite a bit of influence over both the government negotiations, as well as the ministerial appointments in practice. So historically, there have been 2 types of minister. Partisan ministers, which are actually, individuals with a linkage to a party, an active linkage to a party, and representing one of the parties that are part of the governing coalition. But there are also technocrat ministers, which have no partisan affiliation. and are put forward essentially by the king to, to lead a particular ministry. And these are not randomly distributed. Technocrat ministers, generally speaking, lead some of the most sensitive or important ministries, like the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and so forth. And this is seen kind of by scholars as a source of palace influence over these sectors. Okay, so briefly to talk about how the institutional structure of Morocco is set up. The constitution gives the king essentially unchecked political power in the sense that no other actor has direct authority over him. And he has authorities over both the legislature and the cabinet in this case. But the legislature has a number of authorities that are quite typical to a parliamentary setting. It passes legislation, it has authorities over the government, the cabinet, that is excluding the king. It can censure ministers, though this is rarely used. And as with most other parliaments, deputies can submit queries or requests to ministers in both oral and written form. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on two aspects of these institutional authorities. First, I will examine the ability of legislative deputies to submit written requests to cabinet ministers in order to illustrate how this constitutionally allocated authority can actually substitute for clientist linkages in this setting as a means of attracting electoral support. But then I will take a step back and look at how the previously discussed ability of the king to influence cabinet appointments actually can undermine this activity in meaningful ways. Okay, so I want to start by talking about written queries. And these are, again, queries that are submitted by elected deputies, members of parliament, to ministry offices, the head of the given ministry, in order to receive a written response, an official written response from that ministry. And I want to establish here that written queries offer, in practice, a mechanism through which to perform constituency service and address local issues that voters care about, essentially to satisfy the demands of the electorate in this case. This is clear both from deputy interviews as well as the substance of the queries that they submit. So deputies say in interviews that they use them to gather information, to pressure ministers to deal with problems within their district, and just in general to hold the bureaucracy to account for its performance. In interviews, deputies stress that these are very useful in dealing especially with local issues and in interacting directly with constituents. They often will take the response from the ministry and direct it to their constituents to show that they're working on their behalf and getting things done. And this is generally consistent with how these types of queries are used in other contexts, such as in the UK, another parliamentary system. In practice, most of these queries basically look like we should expect based on how deputies characterize them. Most of them explicitly address a district or sub-district unit, that is to say something at the provincial or prefectural level in Morocco, which is around approximately equivalent to the legislative district, or something at the communal or municipal level. A large majority of queries, around 77%, included a specific place reference. So these are really dealing with individual issues specific to a geographic area. And a typical query is aimed at an issue related to public goods. So for example, a deputy from the Party of Justice and Development queried the Ministry of Energy and the Environment about the lack of drinkable water in a couple of small villages within his district. Furthermore, these are targeted at the relevant ministry, the ministry that to which they're most topically linked. So a USFP deputy, another opposition deputy, submitted a query about a municipal health center to the Ministry of Health. So we do see these, working as we would expect, basically a way for deputies to interact in a formal capacity with the bureaucracy. And this is, again, similar to how things work in other parliamentary systems. So they offer this official mechanism for performing constituency service. And in this case, it's allocated to election winners, not just to those people that are most closely linked to the pre-existing patronage network. And additionally, I think it's worth noting that deputies actually submit a huge number of queries. So in the 5-year 2011 term, they submitted more than 27,000 unique queries to different across a range of around 30+ ministries. But there's a huge amount of variation, again, at the deputy level. Some deputies didn't raise a single query, while others submitted hundreds or even thousands of these. And I want to move from here to something that I think has important implications for how politics work in this setting, which is that the dominant pattern in query submission is actually between royalist and opposition parties. So the average opposition deputy submits 10 times as many queries as the average royalist. This figure shows the distribution on a log scale of query submission at the deputy level by party type. And the log scale is to make it easier to see, because as you can see, a lot of deputies submit fewer than 100, while some submit hundreds or thousands. But what's most important to note here is that the most activist royalist deputy, the person who submitted the most queries, submitted around 100, a little under 100 queries. But this is only in the 60th percentile for non-royalist deputies. 40% of them submitted more than that, and most of them submitted and in the hundreds. Oops, sorry. So this was only, so I don't want to bore you with the regression findings here, because I'm going to show plenty of those later, but suffice it to say that this is a difference that is both substantively and statistically significant. So this was the largest, the party affiliation was the largest predictor of activity among a number of other deputy characteristics. So we just see this really differential pattern in whether or not party deputies make use of this type of activity across this particular divide. Okay, so the first takeaway that I want to leave you guys with is that this is an institutional authority that's very well suited to addressing district level needs, and that it's primarily used by members of opposition parties, that is to say, people without access to these networks of patronage. So I ultimately think that this suggests that this institutionalized constituency service offers a substitute for this strategy of patronage that we see as being kind of the key linkage strategy in this context. Voters here in Morocco expect constituency level goods, and we have a large body of scholarly knowledge that says that this is supplied by patronage activity for royalist parties. But here I'm showing that there is an alternative strategy that might help to address the same set of citizen expectations. The next question is, does this matter electorally? So I'm arguing that this is a possible linkage strategy that these opposition parties can employ. But if it's going to work and help them, succeed within this context, then we should actually see that voters are rewarding better performing politicians on this metric. So to test this, I'm going to look at the change in party vote share as a function of deputy activity within a district. I'm going to regress electoral outcomes on activity at the party district level, looking at whether more queries submitted by party deputies is associated with better party deputy or party vote share in the subsequent elections. And we do find that there is a significant positive effect of question submission on the electoral result for parties in the subsequent elections. So a log unit increase in the number of queries submitted is associated with about a 1 percentage point increase in party vote share between 2011 and 2016, or at the number of votes level around 750 more votes. So that might not sound like a huge amount, but actually because of the fragmentation of Moroccan politics, a vote share in the single digits is often enough to win a seat. And a 1 percentage point increase would be enough to change outcomes in around 25% of districts in 2016. This is actually, I think, a substantively important finding and a sign that electoral accountability may exist in a place where we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be so visible. But getting back to the idea that this activity is a substitute for patronage, I next compare outcomes by party type. So I'm going to subset to look at royalist and non-royalist parties separately. And I find a striking difference in the pattern here by party type. So for royalists, the relationship between query submission and vote share is essentially flat. They don't do better in districts where they submit more queries, but they're also not punished for engaging in kind of little to no activity. This is consistent with this claim that these parties are operating off the books. They're working through patronage. We're not seeing that they're calling people, they're engaging in background chats. They're not submitting on the record requests to the bureaucracy. But for non-royalist parties, there's actually a really large and statistically significant difference in vote share based on query activity. So here we see that a log unit increase in queries for this type of party is associated with around a 1.5 percentage point increase in vote share. So, 50% larger than the coefficient in the previous regression. And I interpret this as suggesting that this actually does constitute a viable linkage strategy for this party. There's a substantively and statistically meaningful increase in support associated with this activity. So this brings me to the next kind of key implication. These institutional authorities actually matter because they enable political outsiders to compete electorally. Parties that don't have or wouldn't have the same level of access to traditional patronage networks can supply a similar set of goods using their institutional authorities. And these by-the-book politics can then satisfy voters in a meaningful way. Okay, so at this point, I want to switch gears from talking about legislative behavior to looking at how this activity is dealt with by the executive. So the flip side of this is that there are potential limitations to the strength of this mechanism. These are requests submitted by MPs to ministers, but in Morocco, as in other autocracies, the constitution favors the indirectly selected executive over the openly contested legislature. So as a result, deputies don't have a strong enforcement mechanism for requiring that ministers respond to their requests. And that means that in practice, many requests go unanswered. So only 2/3 of the queries that were raised by deputies in 2011 ended up receiving a response. And this was a source of frustration for members of parliament. They complained frequently about the slow or non-response from ministers, even sometimes to the news media. And this is really low in comparison to more advanced democratic contexts. So in the UK, just as a point of comparison, 98% of questions receive a response. So what might explain this variation? Well, recall from my previous explanation of how the cabinet is formed that there are 2 types of ministers typically included: partisan ministers with partisan linkages, and technocrat ministers that are selected by the king and without any separate relationship to parties or their deputies in office. So if the regime seeks to undermine independent authority of the legislature, and in turn this kind of institutionalized form of governance that is especially useful for opposition parties, then we might expect that its appointees are less responsive to deputy requests. They serve essentially at the palace's discretion. They don't really have any independent linkages or forces that are making them accountable to the legislature here. So I want to start by just looking observationally at the response rate across type of minister. And we do see a pretty stark difference here. So this is breaking down responses by whether or not the proportion of queries that received a response by the minister type. And what we see here is that while both non-royalist and royalist partisan ministers answered around 2/3 of queries, non-partisan technocrats only answered 46% of the queries that were raised. So at first glance, this seems substantial, right? This is a pretty big effect. But I want to test this a little bit more rigorously because of the number of selection effects that might govern who gets what kind of question in this setting. So specifically, I want to examine how the type of minister receiving a request affects the likelihood that that query receives a response. The selection effects that I'm concerned about here are numerous. Deputies might direct queries to places that they think are more likely to get a response, or they might be incentivized to bombard the regime and kind of use this as an opportunity to critique it. So to address this, I'm going to use a matching approach to identify a control group that is as comparable as possible on observable characteristics to the queries that are submitted to technocrat ministers. So I use nearest neighbor propensity score matching across 11 covariates that cover both the timing and the content of a query, as well as attributes of the submitting deputy, things like were they a committee head, how long have they been in parliament, and so forth, to create a matched data set where the treatment, whether or not a query was submitted to a ministry led by a technocrat group, is as comparable as possible to the control group. I'll use an OLS specification here with ministry fixed effects and controls for query attributes to look at whether or not this treatment predicts response rates. And here ministries or standard errors are going to be clustered at the ministry level. So again, the effects are pretty consistent with what we saw observationally, and they are quite striking. So technocrat ministers were around 22 percentage points less likely to answer a query that was submitted to them. This is a substantive and statistically large effect, basically. We see a really, this is, around a third lower response likelihood in this context. So as a robustness check, which I'm not going to show here, I conduct a difference in differences test that uses a cabinet reshuffle that occurred midterm to see if we find the same kind of effect. And in fact, we see consistent results and even substantively larger effect of this technocrat treatment on ministry responsiveness. So finally, I want to note, just clarify that this effect is not being driven by co-partisan responsiveness. We might expect that, PJD deputies are more likely to get an answer from PJD ministers. That's not actually what we see. Ministers were not significantly more likely to answer queries raised by deputies from their own party. So this seems to be a real effect where technocrat ministers are just not answering the requests of the legislature, and the legislature has effectively no really simple way to hold them to account for this. So the takeaway here is that deputies have this avenue for constituency service. They can benefit electorally from making use of it. It can substitute for their lack of personal connections, but the effectiveness of this approach might be diminished by regime control of the cabinet. In part, this reveals the importance of partisan ministers, of having partisan ministers in office and not relinquishing control of the cabinet to the regime. We might actually expect reduced legislative effectiveness if more of the cabinet were governed by technocrats. And it's worth noting here that technocrats are in Morocco and as elsewhere, often in charge of the most sensitive and important ministries. So this is not kind of randomly distributed across ministries, and that might influence the effectiveness of the ability of the legislature to essentially influence the behavior of the executive. All right, so I want to wrap up because I'm really interested in questions, but I'm going to say a few things about the implications of these findings as I see them for Morocco and for political science more broadly. So I think that this demonstrates that institutional authorities matter in a way that it's hard to see from the outside. Institutional framework creates an opportunity for people without access to pre-existing networks of power to compete. And these constitutional authorities can actually substitute for patronage mechanisms to allow political outsiders to provide the goods that voters want in this context. This in turn allows those political outsiders to compete electorally. So it gives them, the opposition, an opportunity to kind of enhance their own level of support. And I don't want to put too normative of a spin on things here, but in some ways, I guess this is kind of an optimistic finding. Politics is working in a sense the way that it should, with voters rewarding good performance in office. But on the flip side, there are some limitations to the ability of elected representatives to serve their constituents. And in particular, that depends on the incentives of ministers to respond to their requests in a setting where there's no strong formal horizontal accountability, and they don't have the ability to demand responsiveness from the executive. So cabinet composition might matter for governance here. And there, scholars of Morocco, I think in general would agree that the regime influence over the cabinet is an important factor in the political landscape here. But this is actually offering some systematic evidence that technocrats deal quite differently with the legislature. It also reveals the kind of bargain, I think, required by co-optation. So outside participation in Morocco may in fact be necessary to strengthen the position of the legislature, since it is kind of constitutionally disadvantaged here. So it's requiring this sort of Faustian bargain. And we've seen a lot of opposition parties in Morocco go through this cycle where by USFP most prominently, by participating in government and getting into closer proximity with the regime, they're then beset by allegations that they've sold out or they've become co-opted in kind of a bad sense by the regime where they're a little too proximate. This in turn, so this is sort of illustrating one possible pitfall of these constitutional authorities, which is that if you're going to win votes and you want to make the cabinet more effective, you have to kind of participate in it, and that means being in very close proximity to the regime, which might threaten your status as an outsider party. Finally, I want to say a little bit about what I see as next steps for this research project. So this tells us a lot about how the political elite in this setting behave in office, including both the regime and the opposition. But what I think we don't understand quite yet is how voters perceive this kind of activity. So the legislature in general and political parties are not highly regarded by Moroccans. So I'm wondering, how do voters perceive this activity? Would it improve their opinion of the legislature to know that they are kind of functioning in this official capacity in the way that they are constitutionally expected to? And do they ultimately care how they get goods from their political representatives if they still end up getting those goods? Do they differentiate between this over or under the table version of providing district level assistance? So in the next steps, I'm hoping to collect some public opinion data to address these questions. And then I'll ultimately also want to look at some of the downstream outcomes of having different types of ministers in charge. So I'm showing here that different types of ministers are more or less responsive to deputy requests, but is this difference between partisan and technocrat leadership visible in other ways? More generally, globally, we have kind of a normative expectation that technocrats are less likely to be corrupt than partisan ministers in office. But the findings here maybe challenge that a little bit, and I'd like to see if that manifests in other aspects of ministerial performance. All right, so I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and comments on this project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Erin, for a really excellent talk. I think if we were all in the same space right now, you'd hear some thunderous applause. So we have a good amount of time for some questions, and I just want to abuse my position to ask the first question. So this talk is about us, these kinds of institutions and the way they function in authoritarian regimes. And I guess I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit about how representative Morocco is of authoritarian regimes, either writ large or even of authoritarian regimes in the region. It seems to me, both on paper and in practice, that people in our part of the academy have long recognized that Morocco, a place like Jordan, a place like Kuwait, that's a particularly inclusive kind of regime that is probably not comparable, say, to an Egypt or a Saudi Arabia. Could you reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. So I think that, one of the distinctions, obviously, with Morocco is that it is a monarchy. And I think that the fact that the palace has no particular political party representing it in electoral competition is important and allows them to kind of, allows it to create a barrier between the performance of the legislature and its own performance as part of the executive. And maybe makes this a bit lower stakes for it and lets it allow kind of more intensive competition to occur. That being said, I think you see kind of a similar, I think the main scope condition here is actually that there is some constitutional authority allowed to the legislature and there is some multi-party contestation. I mean, I wouldn't expect electoral accountability based on performance in a place where elections are fraudulent or where parties that do better are not allowed to compete in the subsequent election. So with great regime interference, I wouldn't expect these kinds of results to hold. On the other hand, I think that the legislature is in general a more open institutional body in a lot of places than anything related to the executive. So while executive elections are really intensively controlled, the legislative elections are more likely to be multi-party, more likely to be free and fair and seen as such by international observers. And so I think that to the extent that there is within the spectrum of full competition to zero competition, areas that are somewhere in the middle, this kind of behavior might hold. I'll just mention as well that one of the goals here was to focus on I recognize that Morocco is kind of a specific case, but one of the goals here is actually to focus on an institutional feature or a type of institutional feature, a class maybe of institutional feature that is more common across different polities. So the idea that the legislature would have some control over the executive, some common feature like the ability to make these requests, I think that's fairly standard across a lot of contexts. The idea also that the executive in autocratic contexts is less likely to have a strong, a strong constitutional enforcement mechanism vis-a-vis the legislature is also quite common. So.
Thank you, Erin. I mean, what's fascinating about Morocco is that although like other regimes in this part of the world, what is on paper is not what happens in practice. It seems like the gap between what is on paper and what happens in practice is relatively smaller in Morocco than it is, say, for example, in a place like Egypt. But I just want to get you to think a bit about where this difference comes from, right? Because you're kind of treating the institutions as an exogenous thing, and then you're asking, what is the effect of these institutions? And you're saying, well, they actually increase participation, et cetera, representation. But of course, it could be that the institutions themselves are a function of some balance of power in that society that forced the executive, the monarchy, to come to some kind of deal with elites in the society to produce this more inclusive but non-democratic system. Can you reflect on where the institutions came from to begin with?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and probably, you know, fodder for a paper in its own right. But I think what's interesting about institutions under autocracy is that a lot of people kind of ascribe, you know, a grand regime master plan to this, but, you know, they're writing these, like the Constitution in a lot of places was established pretty soon post-independence and not necessarily modified so much. I mean, you definitely see places where it is modified and so forth, but in a lot of ways, these are kind of adopted wholesale, like they adopt a lot of things wholesale from democratic constitutions. The use of parliamentary institutions, the whole structure of the Moroccan constitution is pretty similar to other parliamentary institutions in more democratic contexts, with the kind of clear exception that the regime has no real accountability to any other body and has some substantial and meaningful authorities over the other parts of the government. That being said, I think that, you know, one way of looking at this is that the regime sets out this constitution, you know, in a way that you know, seems safe enough, like adapts it such that it secures the bulk of political power, and, you know, they can kind of hope that some of these things are just nominal authorities that they're granting to these other bodies, and that's enough to satisfy the electorate at the time and to secure their cooperation. But what you see in practice is that people adapt and kind of create strategies that are well adapted to this this new structure. Like once you've put the constitution in place, it's not so easy to modify it. And, you know, you see modifications happening and then regimes, you know, being forced to revert them. Or, you know, in the case of the Arab Spring, you actually saw a constitutional modification brought on by popular protest that, you know, if it didn't quite, it certainly didn't correct the imbalance in the constitution. It helped a bit by ensuring that the prime minister has to represent the will of the electorate at this point. So there's a stickiness to constitutional authorities in particular, and I think that you also see this kind of adaptiveness of both the regime and the opposition to gameplay as kind of the equilibrium extends out into time. So the opposition in this case has adapted to using some of these authorities, like taking advantage of their position in power to attract electoral support, and the regime has found ways to kind of counter that. This also plays out in the existence of political parties in Morocco, where you have opposition parties and then you have a succession of new regime-linked parties that are kind of the next new best patronage pick. So I think I don't think it's all some like grand master plan, but I think there are ways that both actors kind of compete within this space in a limited way.
That's great. No, and I think, again, the Grand Master Plan hypothesis is probably wrong on its face.
Mm-hmm.
The more challenging hypothesis, I think, for you is that is one that endogenizes the institution to some pre-existing balance of power between, you know, a regime and, say, business elites or other kinds of elites.
Yeah.
So I guess the last question I want to ask before throwing open the gates is to get you to reflect on the, you know, some of the early literature about authoritarian institutions. I'm thinking particularly about work by Jason Brownlee, for example, where he had this great line about semi-democratic institutions having earlier been conceived of as a halfway house on the way to democracy. And he said, no, in fact, the halfway house is a permanent home. And do you have a view on that? Is this kind of genuine, it sounds like, political competition and interest representation that you're identifying in Morocco a harbinger of pluralism to come?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm hesitant to, look into the crystal ball of like what the future holds in this particular case, or even really to connect this too overtly to transitions, because I think that this reflects kind of equilibrium play, in a sense, both parties adapting to the existing rules of the game rather than really pushing against them and pushing for major change. That being said, I think there are some implications of these findings for the future. And this is something that I'm hoping to kind of address with some of the public opinion data that I'm planning to collect. But basically, I want to understand whether behaving in this way, adapting to using institutional authorities might help to, might create some advantages for political outsiders were a transition to take place for other reasons. So if you see upheaval related to economic grievance or so forth, and a transition case like what happened in Tunisia, essentially, we might see that there are some differences in behavior or in adaptiveness of parties to the new world. Like once the core of the patronage network is removed, parties that rely on patronage and haven't learned how to work within the system the way that it's set out might actually suddenly be on the flip side, be less advantaged in that system. So I think that there are some implications. That being said, in Morocco in particular, people are the kind of word on the street is like, oh yeah, like we're on our way to democracy, but there aren't really any clear steps being taken in this setting, and there's been a long history of people kind of managing to subvert the regime, managing to subvert any changes in that direction, and to co-opt a series of opposition parties. So it remains to be seen whether the PJD can avoid that particular challenge pitfall.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Erin. I have the first question by Dr. Gabriel Kohler-Derrick. So let me unmute him.
Thank you, Erin, for the presentation, and I had a bit of trouble with the link, so I didn't miss the first part. But you mentioned the sort of generally low opinion that your average Moroccan on the street might have about these parliamentarians. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the mechanism by which you understand the sort of reward going to these parties for asking these queries, given that there seems, my impression would be that this is probably not information that most voters are particularly aware of when they go into the ballot box to cast a vote. So could you say something about how voters are sort of updating their understanding of what these parties are doing in Parliament when they submit these queries?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, and a very important point. So one thing to note here is, of course, that these queries are, while they're publicly accessible via a database on the official parliamentary website, this is not something that I expect the average Moroccan to either navigate to or care about in kind of a general sense. Like I don't expect that when voters are deciding who to support, that they also download all of the queries that anyone has ever submitted and look at how their deputy performed relative to others. That being said, I think there are I think that this kind of proxies for a particular type of deputy, one that engages in constituency-focused effort, and they evidence this in office by making use of this mechanism that is very well designed for this, but that people would find out about this through a number of different ways. So in some cases, many deputies have local offices, and if they are working hard on behalf of their constituents, they'll be doing so they'll be kind of a public, visible presence within a community. Some deputies actually directly publicize their efforts in these queries in particular, and the responses that they receive to their constituents. So there's one PJD deputy. I have some backup slides here that I can pull up to show this. So politicians actually kind of describe having a lot of direct contact with their constituents, and I expect that this is some kind of networking, good performance metric that gets kind of transmitted through community networks. But like I said, some deputies also publicize their queries and their responses to constituents via their Facebook page, for example. So this is a screenshot from the Facebook page of Ahmed Sadri, a PJD deputy from, I think, Tingbir, and he he asks a couple hundred queries per session, but he also publicizes the actual official ministry response that he receives to his queries on his Facebook page. And he has, several thousand followers and gets many, dozens or more, hundreds of likes and shares on each of these types of posts. So in some cases, people are actually directly observing this behavior. But I think there's another component to it as well, which is that this is really kind of a proxy for locally focused effort, not just good politicians, but good politicians that work for their community. And one way of measuring this, one way that I kind of try to test this expectation is by looking at local references within queries and seeing whether or not this corresponds to local electoral outcomes. So there's Morocco unfortunately doesn't release parliamentary election data at the municipal level, at this smallest administrative level. They only report it at the district level. But what I do is to kind of test this constituency service local focus mechanism is look at municipal vote share from the midterm elections for communal councils in Morocco that occurred halfway through the 2011 term, or I guess 80% of the way through in 2015. And I extract the commune level references, so references to municipalities from queries that were submitted before these elections. And then I look at the link at this municipal level between politician activity focused on a particular place within a district and electoral outcomes. So the assumption here is that a politician representing a large legislative district is not necessarily evenly addressing the problems of all of the parts of that district. He's going to be kind of doing more work on behalf of some communities than others. And I look to see if we see this borne out in how the voters in those communities receive this. And I actually find that, even at this municipal level, party level vote share is increased by around 3.5 percentage points within communities based on an increase in the number of local references that politicians make.
Okay, the next question that I have is by Steve Bai. Let me unmute him. Go ahead, sir.
So I have two questions. One of the findings you have really puzzles me was the one that you presented in the beginning of your presentation, which is that it seems that royalist MPs submit significantly less queries than the non-royalist one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, what are the other channels they can cultivate supporters locally? In the sense that, can they substitute, if that doesn't matter for them, then what matters for those royalist MP to woo their voters? Yeah, can they do something with the patronage link that they have, for instance, like clientelism or something like that? That's my first question. And second is more of a going forward thing. But this is absolutely a fantastic project and really close to my heart, because it kind of resonates with my research agenda on how factional and patronage ties matter, in determining the policy outcome. And I would really interested to see how this patronage logic plays out on local government level.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's a great question, great point. So with respect to royalist deputies, I'm not really kind of, the idea that they work primarily based on patronage is kind of more of an underlying assumption of this research project rather than something that I'm explicitly able to test. And part of that is due to the really great, excellent and large body of pre-existing scholarly work that argues that this is how these parties operate and has studied this in Morocco for decades previously. But the other part of it is that patronage is really hard to track, and use of clientelism is, runs into pitfalls in measurement globally, but especially in a setting like this. So one challenge is that we're not really able to see what these deputies who aren't working through these institutional means are doing. But my expectation in this case is that the way that they cultivate support is kind of exactly as you were describing, using clientelism to interact with citizens. Vote buying is seen as being one of the strategies that they use. I haven't been able to directly measure vote buying, and I don't know that anyone has had to come up with a really great measure in this case, but at least anecdotally, this is very common with this type of party, and as well as local patronage projects. So a lot of if you look at kind of the characteristics of the deputies put forward by these parties, they're often local businessmen, and they have the ability, they have both the connections to the regime and to this historical network to, attain kind of business-related perks, and they're seen as presumably deploying those within the community, and that's sort of the rationale for voters to support them. So I think that again, it's not something that I'm able to test here, but the idea is that that these regime royalist-linked parties may not need to adopt this alternative linkage strategy because they already have one that they have practiced using and have been using for decades. They're not they don't have to learn how to work within the system because they have the little black book with all of the right phone numbers in it, and the ability to call on others for assistance. And voters are expected to kind of know that, to recognize these people when they show up on the ballot, and to support the party that puts them forward. And then your second question, I guess, of how patronage operates in this setting is, I guess, linked very much to this, which is to say that, yes, like there's a historical network of people with very deep pockets and important connections to the regime that's able to secure a lot of lucrative kind of assistance and thereby direct that to their district, but in this case, presumably direct it in less, more under the table means, like through use of clientelism, targeting it to supporters rather than targeting it to public goods issues, like as you see with the bureaucracy in this case. So I think that is kind of, that's where these two competing versions show up, which is to say that there is this way that these other political parties have been able to operate and continue to operate, and we don't see them being punished for their lack of constituency level institutionalized effort because they're already trafficking in through this other linkage strategy. But to counter that, we have an opportunity for opposition parties to gain more support through this more normalized mechanism.
Can I ask you, Erin, just to try to clarify a little bit these two different linkage strategies that you're describing? So you talk about constituency service and patronage, where constituency service is something employed by quote unquote opposition, and patronage is something employed by quote unquote royalists. And by the way, I should say, I don't really like that terminology, and I much prefer the insider outsider language that you were falling into. And one thing, as a subsidiary question, I would really try to push you on is to really define these terms. For example, the PJD is a royalist party. They said they're royalists. So you've got to, we kind of know what you're talking about because they're Islamists and they're cranky, but you need to have a clear definition of what constitutes an insider and an outsider. But to come back to this question, what I really want you to do is just explain for us a little bit more the difference between constituency service and patronage.
Yeah, so I just start by just clarifying, when I'm talking about royalist parties, I mean explicitly those parties that have an open personal affiliation with the palace in some way, and this is not a designation that I'm alone in using. I would say in Morocco, there's a lot of people that this is kind of a commonly accepted typology of parties. But with respect to your question about patronage and constituency service, so I guess the main difference between clientelistic linkages and constituency service as it is seen here is that the former is kind of conditional on support, and the latter is directed more publicly as a public good. And this is a distinction that I think, in order to really to be confident in answering your question, to feel like I'm comfortable making the kinds of claims that I would be making, I need to collect more data at the voter level to understand the extent to which parties are responding only to their supporters versus to kind of the constituency more broadly.
Right. I mean, so one clear difference would be, getting a job for an individual, as opposed to getting the funds for a road.
Right.
And your findings lead me to think that the quote unquote outsiders are getting funding for roads, and the quote unquote insiders are getting people jobs and preferential access to goodies from the state. Now, we also know that that's not quite what happens, right? That an outsider MP, somebody will show up at the MP's office and say, my son needs treatment on the, on the state's dime, and the MP pushes the paperwork through and gets the person's son that treatment. Is that going to be coded as constituency service in your view, or is that patronage?
Yeah, so I mean, again, so the distinction and the line here is definitely, as you say, like not a clearly defined one. You can certainly direct your business, your private corrupt business dollars to renovating a hospital in a district, and you can also equally, as you say, work on Mrs. So-and-so's visa application by directly lobbying the ministry. I actually don't want to make kind of like a normative judgment on whether one of those is better than the other. The focus here is more on the mechanism by which they're providing these goods than the difference in the goods themselves. I think that, from a general standpoint, from the pre-existing scholarship on the way patronage operates in Morocco, and the way that these insider or royalist parties attract support, you do sense that more of their work is targeted at this type of patronage good, as you would describe it, and somewhat less towards constituency service, though not, exclusive to one or the other. And likewise, if you look at the content of the queries that were submitted, only 3% of them explicitly reference an individual constituent. So one person, in this idea that you would expect, like, so-and-so needs a visa, or so-and-so needs a job, or her house refinished, or whatever. And the bulk of them, when you kind of just look at the content of them, are addressing the kinds of examples that I showed, which is to say schools, hospitals, roads, drinking water, etc. So they are more directed at the public, but that again isn't a strong distinction. The difference here is actually, I think, the over versus under the table means of providing these goods, whether they are public or privately directed. So in the patronage, or in the insider case, they're provided with a phone call to the right person. In the outsider case, they're provided through, working through the system as it's supposed to work. Like, I don't think it's necessarily wrong for someone to represent an individual constituent,
Agreed.
but they're doing so by the book as opposed to outside of.
Yeah, no, certainly I agree. I wasn't trying to get you to make a normative distinction so much as to help us think through some of the observable implications. So if, for example, constituency service is getting money to renovate hospitals, building roads, etc., then one of the weird things I should find is that in opposition or sort of outsider districts, I'm seeing more infrastructure dollars than in inside. And that leads me to the question, are insiders and outsiders getting elected in different kinds of districts?
So I think in general, the answer is no. And part of that, is just a look at, so there are some differences certainly in where different parties have political appeal. But from the, let's see. I'm sure, and I haven't looked at this really exclusively. I think it is probably something that will go into this larger project of understanding where people attract the most support. But you don't necessarily see a really stark difference in the parts of Morocco that elect exclusively royalist or exclusively insider or outsider candidates. And in fact, you see this kind of even distribution. The median district at both the municipal and parliamentary level has an even split of people from these two different types of parties. So I don't think, to some extent, I'm not sure that there is a really obvious distinction, at least, at this point, in how voters perceive these and whether, like, which types of voters want the one or the other. But this is definitely an open question and something that I'm planning to address with the public opinion data.
Yeah, and it might be interesting. You could just run some of these analyses excluding the exclusively royalist and exclusively non-royalist districts and see whether. Okay, I have a question from James Ketterer from the American University in Cairo. Welcome, James. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, thanks very much for a really interesting conversation and presentation. And I'm so happy to see legislative studies work on the Middle East and North Africa. You know, for a long time, people like my former colleague Abdul Batlini and others were just very few voices talking about the importance of these institutions in the region. So I applaud you for taking this on. I know that in the first decade of the 2000s, U.S. Agency for International Development ran a couple of big projects with the Moroccan Parliament, and they were particularly focused on constituency services. And so I'm just wondering if that's anything you kind of came across, heard about, and saw any evidence of any kind of difference in outcomes. As I recall, that those projects, I think, also focused on certain geographic areas that are more likely to be outsider districts. You know, the AID projects tend not to be particularly good at kind of reporting on themselves. So I just wondering what you might have come across. And if it's nothing, then it's nothing. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so this is a good question. I actually I'm not familiar with these projects in particular. The study, unfortunately, the data that I was able to access are more recent and don't extend historically to kind of the early decades of the millennium. But I think this is something that I would be very interested in following up on. Yeah, I think it's not necessarily obvious that some districts do better or worse, or where these dollars are directed. So I will definitely look into whether or not these have kind of a functional or like longer run impact on outcomes in these regions.
Excellent. We're coming to the end of our 75 minutes, and I do want to offer a sort of observable implication of your theory, because it sounds like you're saying that because outsiders lack this alternative channel of providing patronage, they use the official channels of providing goods to their districts. And of course, we know that outsider parties are not all the same. And Islamist parties, the PJD, is thought in the literature at least to be possessed of an alternative mechanism for providing services to voters, and that is extensive social service operations, etc. So according to the reasoning offered in your study, should we find in fact that Islamists are less likely to engage in constituency service than other kinds of outsiders because they have the substitute mechanism of service provision through Islamic charitable and other services?
Well, I can tell you that we find, in fact, quite the opposite in the Moroccan case. The PJD is among the most active parties, but I will say that it also has, other scholars have commented on this as well, has quite a distinct structure from the other political parties in Morocco, even amongst the other outsiders, in the sense that it is more regimented and kind of organized in a hierarchical way that allows for upward mobility, whereas other, it's more structured and rewards merit, whereas other parties are seen as being kind of led by a cabal that picks and chooses their friends for office. So the Islamists have, the PJD in Morocco has been one of the most active parties in this regard. Their deputies averaged on the highest number of queries submitted amongst all of the parties, and more than any of the other outsider parties. So I don't think that this is necessary, but I also don't think that this is while this is this kind of official substitute that is an alternative to patronage, it doesn't mean that it needs to be the only linkage strategy through which these parties operate. So it could be part of a toolkit where they, engage both in social service provision through the structure of the, the Islamist organization that is affiliated with the party, in addition to taking advantage of their authorities of office in this case.
So, but Erin, that's exactly kind of where I wanted you to go. So have you really identified here then an instance where the political institution provides different incentives to insiders and outsiders and thus leads to differential behavior. Is that what you found, or have what you really found is something that scholars all over the Middle East have been finding for a really long time, which is that Islamists are just better at doing all kinds of things than their opponents? So when it comes to providing social services, they're better. When it comes to being parliamentarians, they're better and more organized. And it doesn't really have much to do with the different incentives provided by the institution.
No, I mean, so I would push back on that point, certainly in this case. So while they did average more than the other outsider parties also averaged more than all of the insider parties. So there's, this is not a finding that's driven exclusively by the PJD in this context. I mean, I certainly see this as like a very savvy, well-organized Islamist party taking advantage of the tools that are available to them as part of being in office, and working harder, and then certainly some of the royalist deputies, but a lot of the other opposition or outsider parties that have gotten kind of lackadaisical about cultivating voter support in future, and that has paid off for them electorally. But it isn't exclusive to this type of party, and we can also see, like, in looking at the USFP deputies, which was previously a very prominent opposition party that's fallen on harder times more recently, there's quite a striking distinction for PJD deputies in terms of the extent to which they engage in this behavior, and that actually does translate into electoral support for them. So we see that even amongst this this is as far away from Islamists as you can get, there's the same kind of pattern of both engagement in institutional authorities to a higher degree and being rewarded where they are taking advantage of that.
All right. Thank you, Erin. This was really a superb talk. I promised everybody that they were in for an intellectual treat, and I think with your help, I fulfilled my promise. So again, if we were all in the same space, we would be applauding you endlessly right now, but please join me, everybody, in thanking Dr. York for a really superb talk. And we are all, I think, looking forward to seeing this in print in various forms in the very near future. So thank you.
Thanks so much for your questions and comments, everyone. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for joining us and for your great questions. And the video of this talk and the audio should be available online sooner rather than later. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all. Take care.